Paul, the apostle, has always seemed to me to be an enigma, a riddle. He is liked and disliked. He seems to believe beautiful as well as confusing things. He's on the mark so many ways for me. It also seems to have missed the mark, at least now and then. Paul's an enigma in part because the lengthy documentation in his 7 genuine letters and much of the book of Acts brings to relief his very humanness in the midst of the sacredness of his endeavors and teachings. And that humanness makes him admirable in many instances, and at other times, at least from our modern perspective, he seems a bit stuffy or over the top or just plain odd and confusing. Plus, the truth is, even though we know more about Paul than most biblical folk, there are still a lot of things not explained, left unanswered. And so at the end of the day, he is a riddle, a mystery, an enigma. But we do know more about him than almost any religious leader in the Bible, since there are 7 letters written by him, and almost half of the book of Acts is dedicated to stories about Paul. Because Paul's an important part of the New Testament and still talked about a lot even today, we should know his story, even if there's mystery. I mean, any way we cut it, Paul's letters, teachings, and theology have influenced Christianity, and his heroic efforts have helped spread it around the world and eventually changed the Jesus following from a very small Jewish sect to a thriving, large religion. Today's short reading has Paul suffering shameful mistreatment, yet standing firm through courage in God, all the while advising followers of Christ that proclaiming the gospel is both a holy privilege and a dangerous gift requiring courage and cost and character that is pure and selfless and longing to please God, so that we develop a willingness to use the caring instincts of a nursing mother. That's a powerful image. In my experience, there's nothing closer or dearer than the love and relationship of a nursing mom to her child. That's the image of love in action that Paul has backing his faith and wants it to be backing our faith. I read today's passage and I found myself reflecting on who is this guy, this Paul fellow we know a bit about, but not enough. This Paul guy with a passion for facing religious tussles on in a selfless and God-oriented way, all the while trying and striving to be centered in love and care. The deepest and most powerful type of love and care. He's not afraid to want to love and hold others as dear as a nursing mother holds her children dear. As I considered today's reading, I kept thinking we need to know at least the highlights of Paul's life. And so here's a sort of biographical highlight reel on Paul, gleaned from a number of sources. Paul was born in the first decade of the first century, maybe 10 years or so after Jesus. And while Paul never met the historical Jesus, their lifespans overlapped for maybe 20 or so years. And so for most of the second and third decades, they were both alive in the flesh at the same time. Jesus was crucified somewhere around 30 AD. And early Christian traditions report that Paul was executed in Rome around 64 AD. Before he died, Paul had one heck of a dynamic life by any standard. He was born in Tarsus, a thriving, dynamic metropolitan capital city of a Roman province. There's a very fine university at that time in Tarsus, and the city was at a great crossroads of the empire, not far from the Mediterranean. And so Paul's hometown is a very, very important city in his day. Now, while we know where Paul was born, we don't know much about his upbringing. We can say, though, with a great deal of certainty, that his letters evidence he was very well educated. He's not only literate in a day when that was not the norm by any means, but he appears literate in both Greek and in Hebrew. Moreover, his letters don't just show that he was educated, but that he was a very, very intelligent man, one adept at using the complex rhetorical styles and the arguments of his day. Some think Paul's writing suggests he had legal training, which even today we know is a sign of pure brilliance. Tarsus is not in Palestine. It's located between the Greco-Roman homelands and the Mediterranean in today what we would call Turkey. See, Paul, like most Jews of his day, was from diaspora, the name given to the area of the world where Jews were dispersed beyond the homeland of Israel. And this gave Paul the distinct advantage of understanding Gentiles since he grew up among them. A people and a culture that the early church leadership in Jerusalem had a very difficult time relating to because their homeland was occupied by foreign Gentile forces. It was not more or less a part of the Gentile world like Tarsus was. Somewhere along the line, probably from his father, Paul learned the trade of tent and awning making, a very valuable skill at the time, which allowed him to earn his living in the mission field. Paul's father was said to be a citizen of the Empire of Rome. It was a privileged status that was granted to only a few residents, and as the son of a Roman citizen, Paul would also have been given citizen status. And although Paul never mentions being a citizen in his letter to the book of Acts, claims that he was. Paul does mention having a physical infirmity, and there have been centuries of theories about what it was. And John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg speculate that since malaria was common in Tarsus, and Paul's reoccurring weakness and stabbing pain and ecstatic experiences match malaria symptoms, they suggest that was probably Paul's lifelong disability. Paul's dad was not only a citizen, but was said to be a Pharisee, and so too Paul. Pharisaic Judaism emphasized maintaining cultural practices so that Jewish identity and the religion wouldn't be diluted from the Greco-Roman influences of the day. Pharisees were a Jewish sect we might call a denomination. Pharisees emphasized obeying the law of Moses and the tradition of the elders, focusing on holiness. And some Pharisees in the New Testament were hostile to Jesus, and some were very helpful to him. Paul was initially of a Pharisaic vein that was hostile to the post-Easter Jesus movement. And within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion, Paul, by his own admission, persecuted that small but growing sect of Jews and followed the risen Christ, a sect that later becomes Christianity. And so, the adult Paul started out as a Jewish Pharisee, and as a young man, he persecuted the Jewish Jesus followers for heresy, trying to quell the Greco-Roman influence from diluting and corrupting Judaism. Paul must have been of the mind that Jesus' followers were doing just that by asserting Gentiles could become full members of the people of God without following Jewish conversion rituals. He was doing them. That's what they were doing. So Paul, and some but not all of the Pharisees, were trying to stop them from changing Judaism into something other than what he and those who thought like them believed it should be. You see this kind of thing still going on in Christianity today, right? Paul sums up what he's doing like this in Galatians. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. In the book of Acts comes Paul, who was then called Saul, as we heard in the children's story, was at the stoning of Stephen, approved of it, and that later Paul was, quote, breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, end quote. Paul was doing his persecution stuff in and around Damascus when something extraordinary happened in the mid-30s. Paul had an intense, life-altering vision. Marcus Borg puts it like this: according to Acts, Paul saw a great light, and the light identified itself as Jesus. And according to Paul's letters, Paul saw Jesus. And what he saw and experienced convinced him that he was wrong. That the Jesus who he had been persecuting was not only alive, but Lord. Marcus Borg. From this mystical and marvelous event forward, Paul becomes an apostle of Jesus. An apostle is someone who is sent, and according to Paul, he is an apostle sent by Christ to form new communities. And first he goes to what we call now today Jordan. We know almost nothing about what he did there. We do know that later in the 40s, Paul traveled to a mission field in Turkey as the subordinate of Barnabas. And later Paul and Barnabas split, with Paul going to Asia Minor and Greece, spending a good deal of time in Corinth and Ephesus. And Paul traveled by foot and by boat. And he walked over mountains and long, dusty roads, and he traveled over the water on man and wind-powered boats. And a lot of it was dangerous journeying. Geography is not the only threat. Unlike our culture, free speech and religious choice are not legal rights back then. And so Paul's work leads to arrests and beatings and imprisonment. And Paul provides a summary of the dangers that he experienced in this remarkable text from 2 Corinthians. After generally asserting he's had experience of great labors and imprisonment and countless floggings and near death, he lists these examples. He writes, 5 times I have received the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, dangers from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. In Damascus, the governor guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall. Escape from his hands. Those are Paul's own words. Whenever I get a mean or a snarky comment about practicing and preaching and teaching Christ's love-centered theology, I try to remember to compare them to Paul and Jesus' list of abuses, and I smile with relief that my work has not exposed me to anything near the abuses that they endured and persevered through. Paul faces so much danger, he's nothing short of heroic by any standard in his mission work. Paul experiences some of this hellish stuff because he starts doing what he once persecuted others for. Paul is now the one promoting a form of Judaism that allows Gentiles in without following long-established Jewish rules. And so he's persecuted like he persecuted. But another part of the turbulence that Paul faces is likely due to is not corrupting Judaism, but going into synagogues and siphoning off Gentile community members who were participating but not converting because they found Jewish rites and rituals unacceptable. And Paul goes in and he offers a way to be Jewish without concerns and requests to comply with the unacceptable rites and rituals. So Gentiles join the Jewish Jesus. And they leave synagogues, taking their time and their talent and their treasures with them. And this, understandably, is not cool with some of the local synagogues. And it made Paul very unpopular. On top of which, Paul gets into tiffs with the early church leaders. They argue mostly over the same stuff that gets him in trouble elsewhere. It's the same stuff that got Jesus into trouble and still gets us into trouble. The practice, preaching, and teaching of a wide open embrace of love for everyone, equality, egalitarianism, and a God whose love has no strings attached, regardless of what ancient scripture said or how others interpret it. Paul is not following a number of biblical dictates in order to spread God's love far and wide, in particular to the Gentiles. Paul's given charge, eventually by the church leadership, over converting the Gentiles. That's his audience in the mission field, and he ignores scriptural edicts that are not core to the practice of loving neighbors. Paul knows his audience, and he knows what will work, and he argues with early church leaders that Gentile Jesus followers don't have to follow Jewish rites and rituals and dietary rules. And the leaders, on the other hand, argue that they do have to follow them. As we see in his letter, Paul also argues with leaders and members in the churches that he's founded. Plus, Paul is arrested in prison and eventually killed because he's in conflict with Roman authorities. Paul can be understood as embroiled in conflict almost everywhere he turns. He experiences conflict with some Pharisees, synagogues, church leaders, church members, and Roman leadership too. And Paul's conflicts in his life in, it's believed, when Nero has him executed in 64 as a part of Nero falsely blaming Christians for that great fire that raged through Rome. If you read Paul's letters and the book of Acts, you can get a feel for a lot of the conflict Paul must have encountered, the scars and the wounds, and his strength and resolve in providing loving responses as a part of his theology. And Paul sums up this core theology best for me in Romans 13:10 like this: love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And in today's reading, if we listen carefully, we can hear some of this biographical stuff still vibrating in his words as he alludes to some of what he went through. Some of the wounds and the scars affect him still. But what I love best is that he overlooks those wounds and scars so that we can experience in Paul's writing even stronger, much stronger vibrations of the light and the love that he first encountered on the road to Emmaus. It still dances off the pages and sings in the love song of his prose. You yourself know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, we had the courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God, who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. We were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. Paul of Tarsus, Paul, an apostle of Christ. May we overlook our wounds and scars and learn to so deeply care for others that we become determined to share with them not only the gospel of God, but our own selves through our loving acts and our loving words. May we aim to treat others as dearly and as precious as a nursing mom treats her child. May the reason be that others actually become that dear and that precious to us.